All right, hello everyone. I'm just double checking to make sure everything is recording here. It looks like we are live here on my YouTube channel, and in this video I want to share some information and some examples of surfaces that you can oops. Hopefully this is still connected here. I don't know if I'm running into any problems. I think we're good. Okay, anyway, sorry about that. I wanted to talk in this video about surfaces that you can use to paint on and what those differences are going to be depending on what you choose to make your paintings on. Now, this video it's really intended for students that I'm teaching online at the university level. This semester I have a class that I'm teaching that's sort of a comprehensive oil painting class, and the materials that we're using in that class are either canvas panels that were purchased through a manufacturer or oil painting paper, which is a sort of like primed cotton paper, heavyweight paper. I shouldn't say primed, it was more of a internally sized paper that's designed to have a much longer lasting archival quality for being a unprimed painting paper. So that's a material that we've been using already in this class to make things like color charts, or if you're watching this video at the start of the semester, this is part of the reason I have this material for us. So one of the benefits of using oil painting paper is that you don't have to gesso this material. You can just start working with oils right on the surface. Just one thing to note, I would not use this material for paintings that you want to last for a very long time. In my experience, these oil painting papers, they're really convenient. They work really well. They store very easily because they're very thin. Once the paintings are dry, you can keep these in a folder or a binder or a flat file if you have access to a flat file. But over time, I do notice that's the back side of those pieces of paper, if they were not primed with gesso or an extra sort of size, that the oil tends to leach through the paper. So just as like a disclaimer from, my experience, I would not use oil painting paper to do large scale, sort of studio work. But that's one of the materials that we're using in our class. Another material, as I mentioned, was a canvas panel, which I don't have currently available in my studio. I don't usually order canvas panels these days. I typically am just making everything from scratch out in my garage. But I do have a linen panel that I made using 1/2 inch, I think this was maple plywood, and then it was sized and sealed before I mounted a piece of linen onto the wood. And then that piece of linen, after it was dry, was also sized and sealed before putting on a layer of oil ground over the surface. So that's the surface that we're looking at here. You can probably already tell that the texture on this is much more organic. There's a lot of little refracting breaks in the light. There's a lot of texture from the bristle brush that I was using to apply the oil ground as well. So this is sort of similar to what you'll be working on with your larger canvas panels. The difference probably initially is that the texture is not going to be the same, because with my oil primer or with the acrylic gesso that you would be using, that's going to give you more organic breaks in the surface of your panel, which may impact the finished look and feel of your painting. So part of this video is to talk a little bit about things that we want to think about before we make our paintings, and ways that we can choose to manipulate and control the surface of our substrates, right? So these are all different types of substrates that we're working on. The last example that I have here currently on the video is this also maple plywood panel. It's 1/2 inch thick again. These are like cabinet grade pieces of plywood. So if you're going to work on plywood, I would try to buy plywood that is very smooth. So typically ones that have a very high quality veneer on the outer planes. So maple, birch are two of the types of plywood that I would recommend. Other types of plywood might be made from wood that is sort of in like a softer family of trees, like pine trees, and those tend to have a much more noticeable grain pattern and just a softer surface. So by using a hardwood, that usually is going to help give us a stronger surface to work on. So again, I mean, those are things that we might have to think about before we even begin preparing the surface for painting. You know, the benefit of being a painter today is that we have a lot of choices for materials that we can purchase from suppliers and manufacturers that are doing all of that research. So this video is sort of like kind of a resource for information. It's not necessarily a invitation to do all of this stuff. It's just information for you to know that may inform your material choices in the future or paintings that you choose to make this semester. Before I continue, I did want to just talk a little bit about canvas, because the word canvas can mean two different types of materials in general. I mean, there's more than two types of canvas that artists paint on, but the two most common types of canvas are cotton canvas, which is made from 100% cotton. Sometimes you'll see it's like duck cotton, which I'm assuming is a type of cotton plant. This is a much more affordable type of canvas. Let me see if I can bring this up so you can really see the texture here. I order my canvas from Dick Blick, and I buy it in large rolls. It ends up being a lot more canvas for the money that I spend if I buy things in bulk like that, and then I unroll the canvas and I cut out the size that I need to either glue and mount to a panel or to stretch around a cradled panel or a stretcher. But this is a good place to start if you want to make large paintings. Some artists will take loose pieces of canvas and they'll staple it onto a wall, a studio wall, and then prime the canvas how they normally would, make the painting, and then once the painting is dry, they can peel the painting off the wall and then build a stretcher to then staple and stretch it to. So some artists will work that way, and you know, some of those artists won't even make a stretcher. They'll just put like grommet, little metal hardware, where you'll punch a hole through the canvas, you'll install the grommet, and then you can hang it on like little nails on a gallery wall or with string or something like that. The other kind of canvas is linen canvas, and this is much more expensive, and that is because it's a much harder or more difficult canvas to produce. It takes a lot more time and energy. Linen canvas like this is made from flax seed, which is also the same organic plant and material that we get our linseed oil from. So the flax seed and flax plant is a really important plant when we think about or talk about oil painting and the history of oil painting. So it takes a lot longer to grow the flaxseed plants than it does to grow cotton. At least that's what I've sort of found in the little research I've done between the two types of materials and plants. But because flax is a much stronger type of fiber, the linen that we make with that plant is much more durable. It's a lot stronger than cotton canvas. Like, it would be really hard for me to rip this piece of linen compared to this canvas, which, you know, this is a heavier weight canvas, so this probably isn't the best example. Which also brings me to one other thing I wanted to mention. They do make both types of canvas in different weights. So if you buy a lighter weight canvas, it's going to be a lot thinner, a lot weaker. So if you're doing a stretched canvas, I would recommend picking a medium weight to heavy weight canvas if you're going to be making a large painting at some point. If you're mounting it like I like to do on panels, I think that's a little less of a concern. But either way, that's kind of the big difference between these two types of canvas that you might choose to work on. Now, the other thing I should mention, and I talk more about this in a video that I posted a few years ago on my YouTube channel, which you can go and watch, that covers like supports, panels, canvases, that type of stuff. But I'll mention it again here, is that whenever you're working on a material that is organic, right? So these are organic surfaces and materials. You want to make sure that you're properly protecting that material from your subsequent layers of your paintings. So especially with oil painting, I mean, it's also important with acrylics, but with oil painting, the oil can get through to this organic compound, and it can very slowly over many, many years start to wear away and degrade the organic fibers of this material. So artists will use things like a PVA size to seal their organic surfaces, and this is a step that we take before we prime the surface for painting. So we're at this level or stage, we're just trying to seal and protect whatever we're painting on, whether that's paper, wood, canvas, anything that's organic. Historically, artists would use a material that is also organic, but was really effective in sizing and sealing those surfaces, was rabbit skin glue. Today, this is a byproduct from the meat industry, and it's not necessarily made from rabbits. It's just sort of like gelatin that's collected from various animals and then processed into this dried kind of fiber. You can see it at the bottom of this bag. And basically how this works is you would soak those little like pellets or little tiny like, you know, I don't know how else to call those little pieces of dried rabbit skin glue, but you would resaturate them and it would form more of a gel and it would expand, and then you would very slowly heat that gel until it melts the glue, and then as a liquid you would brush that onto whatever your support is. So if that's linen or if that's wood, paper, it's going to help seal those things. And there's new research nowadays between using an organic size, which would be like the animal skin glue, rabbit skin glue, or what we call RSG, and a acrylic polymer based size. So there's really two different ways you can go with this. You know, I think of it from a couple angles, like, you know, in terms of environmental impact, this is organic. Here it's not going to have the same sort of, you know, long-term effects in terms of microplastics and that kind of stuff. However, this is known to shift and flex a lot with changes in humidity. So paintings that are dried and finished, and years after they're finished, they can crack and have other problems due to the climate that the painting is sitting in, especially when you're using something that's organic like rabbit skin glue. So you can look into both of those things if you're interested in knowing what's best. But you know, just so you know, that's information that you have access to. And I don't remember if I held this up and showed the surface, so I just wanted to compare what the surface differences are like between these different materials. So again, this is a piece of 1/2-inch plywood. I like to use the 1/2-inch plywood because it takes a lot more moisture and humidity to warp a 1/2-inch panel, compared to a 1/4-inch panel. But you know, depending on the kind of framing you want to do, you got to be kind of mindful about the depth of your panels, because certain frames might not work well with a thicker panel like this. But you know, again, there's a lot of different variables that come into our material choices. Just so you know, this is also primed with an oil ground, so it's not an acrylic gesso top coat. Some of these surfaces that I've made, there is a layer or a few layers of acrylic gesso underneath the oil ground. The reason I like to finish my surfaces with a layer of oil ground is because that kind of helps me avoid that sunken in effect that we often find with oil painting, where different pigments might react differently to the surface of what you're painting on. There tends to be a pattern with acrylic gesso where certain colors in particular, the oil will absorb into the gesso, the acrylic gesso, at different rates or to different degrees, and you can have a very uneven surface. So this has been really helpful for me to get a more even surface because I'm starting on a full layer that has oil paint essentially on that surface. So anyway, those are a few descriptions of what I have here, and at some point in this video I do want to just take a color of oil paint and thin it with my Gamsol, which I keep in one of these metal sealable containers. So this is definitely something I would recommend investing in at some point if you're going to keep painting. I don't want to spill this, but you can see that it has one of these what are they called, sort of brush cleaner wells that sits to about that deep inside of the jar, so I can clean my brush, and if it's filled with enough Gamsol, the brush is sort of like rubbing that little mesh metal well that's inside of here, and what's happening is that the Gamsol is diluting all of the oil paint out of the hairs of my brush, and that pigment that's coming out of the brush, it settles over not a lot of time, but within a day your Gamsol will be fairly clear again, and all of that pigment will fall down to the bottom of the jar. And then after a year, or depending on how often I'm using Gamsol, I might need to clean it out and dispose of all of that waste at the bottom. Something just that's coming to mind as I'm talking about that process, I've seen things online where artists will say, oh, that sludge that ends up at the bottom of your Gamsol, I've seen artists in videos take that sludge out and then tone their surfaces with that. I would not recommend doing that, mostly because there's so much Gamsol that was in that pigment that ends up creating a very brittle surface in your painting and in the layers of your painting. So I would just use your oil paint and kind of a mixture that you want to come up with that isn't so heavily thinned out or dried out because of Gamsol. So just if you see that online, I would probably avoid doing that. You can try it and see what happens. You know, you're always welcome to do that. But okay, a couple other substrates before I show examples of what the paint will do on these surfaces. And again, this is a video that's intended for students of mine that I'm teaching online, and things that I would normally demonstrate in person. So this video is going to be kind of a supplement to that side of our class. So I've mentioned the oil paper, and there are two companies that I've purchased oil painting paper from. Arches was the first company that I saw releasing oil painting paper a few years ago. I think when I was still in college, I had started to play around with that paper. And then most recently, I'm just grabbing something off camera here. Most recently, a few years ago, I started noticing that another paper company called Legion Paper started making their own oil paper material as well. So it's a really, new way of helping artists, find really quick, convenient solutions for their process. And most of the time, I would say I use oil painting paper for a substrate that is very mobile, travel friendly. So if I'm on a trip for a landscape plein air painting trip, sometimes I'll bring pieces of oil painting paper just to use as study material, or if I'm flying and I don't have a suitcase, I can fit a lot of this paper in a backpack with a small painting kit, things like that. So, and I probably wouldn't be using oil painting materials if I didn't have a suitcase, but regardless, I wanted to show a few examples of things you can do with the oil painting paper to make it more durable, to things you can do at different stages of the process. So up here I have a loose small piece of Legion's oil painting paper that, again, I'll demonstrate at some point. But before I do that, I wanted to share a few examples. So this is the same paper. You can see on this side it has the out of the package sort of surface. This side of the paper was not primed or sized with any material. So this is what it looks like on one side. You can see it's a little pulpy. I'm trying to get my phone to focus here on the texture, but it's a little bit of a challenge. So you can see there's a little bit of a toothiness to this paper if you don't add a layer of gesso or any other kind of primer or size. On this side of the paper, I put a few layers of acrylic gesso. I think I put two undiluted layers of acrylic gesso on the paper. Let's see if I can get the camera to focus again. So you can see the texture of my bristle brush, my sort of house painting brush that I used to gesso and seal the paper. And the color that we're seeing on the surface was made using a very thinned out layer of a neutral kind of greenish gray pigment to tone the surface. So sometimes when I talk about the painting process and I go, oh, I was working on a toned surface, basically what that means is before I started the painting, I put a color of oil paint down to block out the white of either the gesso or the oil ground or the color of the paper. And that helps for a few different reasons. I think the first reason that comes to mind, and actually I can show you another example of a different color. So this is, again, the same process, the same material. It's the oil paper with gesso. And then usually I'll lightly sand the gesso after the final layer, after 2 or 3 layers of undiluted gesso, acrylic gesso, with 220 grit sandpaper, fairly light textured sandpaper, just to knock down any ridges of really thick acrylic gesso that I don't want to be visible in the final painting. So I like a fairly smooth surface, but I still want there to be a little bit of texture. So let me see again if I can get this to focus here. Hopefully you can see some of the texture that's coming through, because what happens is when you have texture like this and you put a layer of paint down, what I like to do is sort of extend or thin out that layer of paint. If I'm outside, I'll use Gamsol. Otherwise, I'll use my oil solvent-free gel, and I'll mix a little bit of that in with the paint. That way I can, with a paper towel or a rag like this, I can just take that paint and rub it into the surface, and then I can wipe off extra paint if I don't want it to be too dark, or if I want to show more of the texture from the gesso. The reason I'm talking about this is because you can get some really interesting textures and passages and patterns and effects without even using a brush, right? These are things that we can do just with gesso and sanding and then rubbing paint, a very thin paint, into the grooves of all of that texture on the surface of your panel or your canvas or whatever you're working on. And then this was a piece of paper that was mounted to a 1/2 inch piece of plywood. I've been doing these monthly portrait painting sessions here where I live, and I've been working a lot on paper, but I didn't want all of my paper to be loose like this. So sometimes it's easier to glue down your substrate to a panel first and then go through all of these stages of priming and toning the surface. So I would recommend, if you have access to the panels, to mount your paper first if you have the time and the space to do that and the materials. But if you don't, it's okay to also gesso and keep these as loose pieces of paper. Again, there's benefits to both approaches. This becomes a lot heavier. It takes up a lot more space. This is a lot easier to store. You can stack a lot more paintings this way. So again, to each their own, but I just wanted you to know that there are options for things like that. Here's a quick example of a plein air painting I made out in Colorado 3 or 4 years ago on a trip. and actually, yeah, 2.5 years ago. And when I made the painting, it was just on loose paper, gessoed paper. You can kind of see on the very edge over here, this is the color of my ground. So before I left for the trip, all of those loose sheets of paper were gessoed and then primed with these different like semi-muted light value grounds or toned grounds. And then while I was there, I made the paintings. Luckily, they dried before I flew home. And I don't have the little portfolio kind of DIY kit that I use to store the paintings to show you in the video. But basically, I had 2 sheets of foam core with a couple of little like binder clips. And as these paintings dried, I kind of layered them in between those 2 layers of foam core. And that kept my paintings nice and protected, flat, clean while I was traveling. The other benefit of that sort of setup is that I could use the foam core to tape the paper to and make the painting on. So I had like a nice backing board to make the paintings with my very small painting rig that I flew with. And this has been varnished, which is, you know, the reason why it's so shiny. Okay, and this is the back real quick just to show you. This is a sandy plywood. It's a much cheaper, actually, yeah, I think this was sandy plywood. And then I added a little strip of 1/4-inch plywood just to give it more depth to fit in the frame that I had this in at one point in time. So this is 3/4-inch deep now. Okay, the other substrate I wanted to just talk about here. And before I continue, I'm sort of ad-libbing here, but with paper, you know, I've talked about oil painting paper, stuff that is advertised as being suitable for oil painting. However, you don't necessarily need to work on that type of paper if you want to paint on paper. If you don't have oil painting paper, though, you definitely need to make sure that you're properly sealing, or again, what we would call sizing your paper prior to gessoing that paper and preparing it for oil painting. You can also do an oil ground on paper if you want. Either way, what I highly recommend is that you use a fairly thick, or what we would call heavyweight paper, and a paper that is made with without any sort of like glues or adhesives, so things that are acid free. Typically when you're buying paper from an art supplier, you can find all of this information on those listings. The paper will say if it's acid free, if it's made with 100% cotton, which typically is what I would recommend using. A heavier pound or weight paper is going to give you a little bit more stability and structure in terms of the physical sort of characteristics of the paper. But again, you want to make sure that you're properly sealing, or at the very least you're using like 2 or 3 coats of gesso to prepare that surface, if not 3 or 4 coats of gesso. You might also want to seal the backside with gesso as well, just to protect both sides of the paper, because paper is a lot more what's the word I'm thinking of here? It's a lot more vulnerable to aspects of climate, humidity, environments, especially with moisture, that can really damage paper over the long term. So that's something to think about if you want to paint on paper. You can also paint in a sketchbook, which I think I do have an example of that I can show here. So I primarily use Moleskine sketchbooks for my process here, and sometimes I'll work with a water-based paint. So this is made with gouache paint when I was on a trip. Trying to find, I thought I had an example with oil paint in this book. These are some casein paintings. Let me see. I don't know why I'm imagining that there was a oil painting in here. Oh, here we go. So this is a small oil painting made on this Moleskine drawing paper. You know, you can kind of see how thick this paper is in comparison to some of these other papers. But what I did to prepare this surface is I had made a thumbnail kind of like this, either with pen or pencil, that's underneath the painting. And then when it was time to paint over the drawing, I wasn't prepared to kind of show all these materials, but you know, it makes sense if I'm talking about them to also show examples. So this particular paper and this painting was sealed with a, oh, now I'm blanking on the name of the material. It's a shellac. Yeah, so you can kind of see, maybe, I don't know on camera how well this is showing up, but the paper has a slight kind of like sheen to it that other sheets in my sketchbook don't have. That's because there was a coat or maybe 2 coats of shellac that I put down to seal the paper and to seal my drawing before I painted over that with oil paint. The other material that I've used a lot for that process is matte medium, and you can buy matte medium for a few different companies. Golden is the one that I've used to do this, but you might have another supplier or company where you live, or from a supplier that you want to order from. Either way, both of those materials give you a transparent primer for your paper, for your drawings, to protect the paper from the oil paint. And it might not protect it forever. You know, you can see a little bit of like the oil coming through where I, you know, probably didn't prime it as well. You can see that yellow kind of coming through, and this is only after a few years. So this is only like 2 years ago almost. So that's just, again, something to keep in mind is like, it's really good for studies and sketches, preliminary, you know, painting and drawing and that kind of stuff. So I just wanted to talk about this since I was talking about painting on paper. Okay, so now I can move on to the last material, which is what we call ACM panels, or aluminum composite material panels. And basically what that is it's a hard metal and plastic panel. It's going to be difficult to focus here. That is basically comprised of 2 sheets of very thin aluminum. And if you think about the signs that we use along roads and highways for, exit signs, stop signs, today most of those signs are made out of this material. And artists about 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, started using this material as a substrate to paint on after they realized how durable of a compound this is in terms of climate, in terms of weather. You know, if this can withstand rain and snow and ice and hot temperatures and very cold temperatures, you know, it didn't take long for artists to realize how beneficial that would be for a painting surface. So this is becoming more and more of a common material for artists, oil painters in particular, to paint on. But basically, as I was saying, it's made of 2 different pieces of aluminum, and typically manufacturers like Dye-Bond is a really popular one that makes this panel. They usually put a thin sort of primer color, like a white sort of coat, on both sides of that aluminum. And in the middle, this black strip here, that is plastic. And a lot of times, I don't think we can see it on this particular type of ACM, but a lot of times that plastic will have hollow sort of strips running through it, kind of in like a honeycomb or hexagonal pattern. And what that does is it allows the panel to be a lot lighter because there's a lot more sort of like negative space and empty space in that material. Because when these panels are like 4 feet by 8 feet in size, they get really, really heavy. So that's one drawback to working on ACM panels, is that if you have to ship the painting at any point, that's going to be more expensive than working on maybe plywood or other materials. So just things to keep in mind, or especially compared to like a stretched canvas, which is loose canvas. That's, I never really kind of explained that. If you're not familiar with what a stretched canvas is, it's a piece of canvas that is stretched and stapled or attached in other ways to a stretcher frame, which is typically made out of wood. Nowadays you can get them made out of like wood and aluminum. Typically they're made out of wood. But so when you want to work on ACM panels, you want to make sure that you lightly sand or create kind of like a abrasion to the surface. That way, whatever you're priming it with, it has something to grip onto. Otherwise, because this is such a smooth and like glass-like finish, it's really easy for something to just like fall onto the painting or for you to accidentally scratch through your paint right down to that smooth surface. So that's one reason that you want to make sure that you're lightly sanding the surface before you gesso and prime these. Now, from what I've gathered over the years, I don't typically work on this material, so I'm not as familiar, but some artists won't even put a gesso or a primer down because the oil in our paint isn't going to affect the metal in the same way that it would to organic materials instead. There is some research out there, I'm just going to share what I know, where chemical compounds in aluminum can leach into the paintings and it can shift the paintings. I've heard that, or I've seen that in articles before. Again, I'm not as familiar, so this is again just an example of what is out there for painting on. This was a panel that I had purchased when I was working on a mural public art project like 5 years ago, and I had extra scraps that I cut up into smaller pieces for a series of paintings that I was working on a few years ago. So that's why I have that piece. You can also buy pre-made aluminum professional archival panels from companies like Artifacts, which is kind of the main supplier of these kinds of panels. Nowadays, you can really see that super reflective quality on the backside of their panels, and you can buy them primed with different surfaces. So this one is oil primed, which based on the texture, I would assume they're using like a roller to put that oil ground onto the surface. This was a painting I made probably 5 or 6 years ago. I never really finished this painting, but the one thing I personally didn't like about this panel was the texture. I was hoping that they would be much smoother, kind of like the wood panel that I showed. So that was the only sort of problem that I found with that. The other thing I noticed is that sometimes it looks like it has a slight kind of bowing effect because only one side of this panel is primed with any kind of paint. And as that's drying and kind of like shrinking, it's sort of pulling the backside of the panel kind of like this slightly, which you'll really notice that if you're working on masonite panels or like a 1/4 inch plywood panel. That's much more of a concern as opposed to one of these aluminum composite material panels. But if you're interested in painting on something like this, I would go to their website, look at all the different kinds of panels that they create. They're a really good company. I probably would use more of their panels if I could afford it, but for now it's nice to work with organic materials like plywood. They're really easy to produce. The one thing I will note though that is sort of a plus about using the ACM panels is that you can score the surface with like a box cutter knife and a metal ruler. And if you do that a few times on where you're going to try to cut out a piece of your panel, you flip it over, you do it to the other side a couple times, then you can just snap the panel along that scored line. And it's so it's pretty easy to do without wood tools like a table saw or a miter saw to get different sizes. So there are some pros also with working with ACM. Okay, so all of that to kind of cover different substrates that we can use. And then what I wanted to do for the next 5 or 10 minutes is just, I say 5 to 10 minutes, this could go on for another 20 or 30 minutes, we'll see, hopefully not, is I wanted to show what the paint is going to look like on these different surfaces. So with the paper, because I just showed you a couple of sheets of paper with paint on them and the acrylic gesso, I feel like I don't have to show that, but you will see the difference in the texture and the color between this and the unprimed oil paper. Okay, so let's first start with kind of we'll do three different sort of examples of what happens to our paint. I have some, let's see here, off camera, just below the camera, I have my main palette that I use here in my studio. So I'm going to bring a little bit of burnt umber up to this palette that you can see. And this will be the sort of color that we're going to use for all of these different surface tests. So I have two different brushes. I have a hog hair bristle brush, which, as you can see and probably hear, you know, it has very stiff hairs. You can really kind of see each hair because they're really thick. Traditionally, these were made with, you know, pig hairs, other animal hairs that were really stiff. If you start researching brushes, you'll start to see things like sable brushes, which was another type of animal. Kolinsky sable, I think, was a specific type of sable. There's mongoose hair brushes. And over the years, brush manufacturers have started to research and produce brushes that are synthetic. They're not made from animal hairs, that have a similar sort of handling, a similar sort of feel, a similar texture, to give you the same kind of mark without having to source the hairs from particular animals that they were historically sourced from. So I don't know offhand. I'm assuming this is still made with hog hair bristles. But the other brush that I have is a synthetic brush, which hopefully I can get to focus here. There we go. So you can see it's a lot softer. The hairs are a lot thinner. So the mark I'll get with this is going to be a lot more smooth and filled out or complete, because each of those hairs are going to sort of stick together like this as I'm dragging the brush on the surface. Whereas this brush, the hairs tend to kind of spread out as I push down on something, and that'll change the type of mark that I'll get. And then maybe we'll see with how much paint I have, maybe I can even do a little bit with a palette knife, just to show the sort of marks that you can get with a palette knife as well. Let's see if I can get this to focus. So there's a little bit of the paint still on the surface of this palette knife. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to grab my hog hair bristle brush. We'll start with just the paint without any medium or Gamsol. So this is the paint without anything else. This is just right out of the tube. Again, just a disclaimer, the pigment that I'm using is, I think this is from Winsor Newton. It's their artist grade. So if you buy burnt umber from Winsor Newton and it's not the same artist grade tube of paint, it might be different than what you're going to see here on camera, just as a disclaimer. So I'm going to take some of that burnt umber and I'm going to use my bristle brush, and I'm just going to, you know, move this around in different ways so you can see the kinds of marks that I can get. At this point, I've sort of pulled a lot of the paint off the brush, and I'm doing a lot of dry brush techniques, which are very textural and organic. Remember, this is the surface that's really smooth, so all of these textures and marks, most of those are coming from the brush and not from the surface of the panel. Okay, so that's the very smooth oil primed plywood panel. I'll grab a little bit more paint, similar amount of paint. We'll go over to our linen panel over here. You know, so right away we can see where that paint isn't going all the way through like it did with the smoother surface sort of panel, because there's more like little ridges in the surface of the linen panel from the texture of the brush, but also the texture of the linen itself. So I'll move this around in a similar way. Okay, we'll do the same thing again. So now you can see the difference in some of the patterning and the textures here on this panel versus this one. It's pretty subtle, but there are some slight differences. Now let's do the same thing up here with the paper. We'll start in this corner down here. So one thing that I've always found with oil painting papers like the Arches or Legion papers is that it tends to absorb a lot of the oil from our paint really fast, and it's really difficult to get a mark that's really clean and continuous without using a lot of medium or without using a lot of Gamsol. So you can see how it's sort of like almost like a dry brush technique here. You know, in that area with the paint, it takes quite a bit of paint to be able to make something opaque where I can't see the paper anymore, and I'm really pushing really hard. Okay, so now what I'll do is I'll take a little bit of my medium. Actually, here, let me use a, well, actually, let's grab, I'm gonna clean off my palette knife. I have some extra solvent-free gel. This is the medium that I like to use. It's similar to the medium that we have in our material list for our painting class, but this is from Natural Pigments. So this is made with linseed oil and a like chalk compound. So it's organic, it's solvent-free, which is really nice. I'm going to put that right underneath the burnt umber. Okay, so now I'm going to take my brush, I'm going to dip it in some of the medium, just a little bit here. Hopefully you can see how much I have on the end of the brush. I'm going to mix that over here. So without grabbing any paint, you can see how I'm making this pigment translucent, right? We can see through it and it's not quite as opaque anymore. So if I take this over here, I can brush this on. Already right off the bat, it's a lot lighter, right, than the amount of burnt umber that I had without anything mixed into it. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll use this sort of a process to work where I'm trying to stay more in the middle of a value scale, and I'm really just trying to cover an area, because there's what I'm doing is I'm introducing more oil to the pigment and the paint, right? So by adding more oil, what we're doing is we're extending its like coverage basically, and we're thinning it out so it can spread to a farther surface area without sort of jeopardizing the consistency of the oil like we would with Gamsol, which I'll be showing kind of at the end of this demo. So this is all again with a little bit of that medium by adding a little bit more oil. And I've started to talk a little bit so far in the class about how you can glaze with the gel medium really well too. Maybe I'll save that for a separate video just to keep this one a little bit shorter. So I'm going to grab a little bit more medium, do the same thing. I'll grab a little bit more paint just so I have a similar sort of translucency of pigment here, which hopefully you can see. And we'll go over to our linen panel and do the same thing over here. You know, so again, because this isn't as smooth as the plywood panel, it takes a little bit more force. I have to push down a little bit harder to work this into all of those grooves, right? So if you're blocking in an area of your painting, you know, it might vary depending on the tool, it might vary depending on the texture of the surface, it might vary depending on the makeup of your paint mixture, how well that's going to sort of glide or push into the surface. But really this video is all about the texture and just kind of the working properties of our different substrates. So this isn't really a demo on how to paint, it's more just like kind of an example of how things are going to vary depending on the surface that you're working on. You know, but if I do a little bit of sort of dry brushing, you can kind of see what happens there. Notice how much lighter again this is in value to the burnt umber without the medium. So by adding more oil, we're spreading that pigment a lot farther, and with less pigment then it's not going to be as opaque and therefore not as dark in value, especially with a dark pigment like burnt umber. All right, let's just one more time with our oil painting paper. I'll try to keep this in the same part of my palette. Grab a little bit of pigment, maybe just a little bit more. Trying to keep things as controlled for our experiment as possible here, just for the sake of the demonstration. So I'll do this up here. You know, it's a little different on the paper because the paper wants to absorb a lot of that oil in our paint. But again, it is a lot lighter. It also appears to be a lot warmer. So with colors like burnt umber or alizarin, quinacridone, ultramarine blue, those pigments a lot of times are very transparent inherently. When you add more oil or you add more of its vehicle, right? If it's a water-based medium, you're adding more water, or like an acrylic medium. But either way, you'll start to notice where pigments start to feel more chromatic as you thin them out. And typically that tends to correlate with the level of transparency of the pigment that's in that paint that you're using. So this appears a lot more chromatic and a lot warmer and lighter in value, obviously, again, because it's a thinner amount of the pigment that I'm spreading around. Now, again, what's really interesting about this so far is just between these two different steps, I've already opened up a possibility for a range in values, right? A range in light to dark. So you can do this with one color and oil or maybe a little bit of Gamsol, which you'll see in a second, to create this image that is monochromatic, right? Different levels of light to dark within this one hue and this one color family. And that's a really great way to think about layering your painting, right? So this would be a great way to work if you're creating a kind of grisaille method that you're going to be glazing over later on. Okay, let me go ahead and grab a little bit of Gamsol because I'm working downstairs in my studio at home. I don't want to leave my Gamsol open for too long without good ventilation. But you can see where I've already dipped my brush. You know, I'm pushing it against the side over here, and it's taking out a lot of that pigment, right? So basically when you add Gamsol, you're pulling the oil out of your brush, right? And typically what follows is the pigment. And you end up with these images that are less vibrant, less chromatic. There's a lot less oil. So I've been recommending that you probably don't want to use this in the later stages of a painting because it creates a very unstable layer of oil paint. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push a little bit of that Gamsol onto this palette, kind of in this little pile. You can see where it's dripping slightly. And I'm going to grab some of the burnt umber. I'm going to mix this in. Right now it looks darker, but there's still so much Gamsol, especially in this kind of a brush. I've noticed that the bristle brushes hold a lot of liquid. So if you're using Gamsol, it's going to hold a lot of Gamsol. If you're using acrylics, it'll hold a lot of water. But I can push down and more of that Gamsol is going to come out of the brush. But what I want to demonstrate here is how there's still quite a bit of pigment in this little mixture. If I take that over to my first surface over here, right, we can see what happens right away. You know, that looks like a very wet mark, a very kind of like diluted effect and texture. It creates a nice mass of a color really easily and really quickly that feels very solid in comparison to a mixture that had no Gamsol. But what tends to happen is this is going to evaporate over time. If I left this alone, it would evaporate, much like a ring, a sweat ring from a cool glass in the summer on a wood table without a coaster, right? That moisture is going to sit on the bottom and then it's going to evaporate, and any sort of like dust or color or pigment or staining is going to stay in that little wet spot. And the moisture or the liquid is going to evaporate out. And that's kind of what happens with Gamsol too. If I do the same thing over here on the linen, you can just see the difference in the texture. Let's grab a little bit more and do the same thing up here with the paper. Right, and again, you can really see this is almost like a watercolor painting on this paper because the paper is sucking up a lot of that oil, a lot of that Gamsol. It's absorbing right into the surface really quickly and easily. Something I want to share is what you can do with this as opposed to some of these other approaches is it erases really, really nicely and really easily when you're working with Gamsol. And again, this is my smoothest panel or surface here. But if I do the same thing up here, you can see a lot less of that material came off with a similar amount of pressure. And if I get another clean part of my rag here, and I do this over here, right, we're kind of seeing the difference in subtracting the material depending on the chemical, physical properties of the pigment, right? So with Gamsol, by diluting it to that degree, and by basically kind of like disrupting the oil makeup of the mixture, we end up with a very thinned out and primarily like Gamsol layer of paint. You can see where it's already starting to drip down past this little pile here. But when I've talked about, you know, erasing into paint and working subtractively, if you're drawing in your image, this is a really great way to start, is by adding at least a little bit of Gamsol, maybe not this much Gamsol, because it is a very wet surface. You know, but that's, again, something that we can do as a technique for, you know, drawing and thinking about values on our paintings. So this will be a helpful way to sort of see how the pigment wants to stay on each of these surfaces. And again, I'm trying to keep a similar sense of pressure down for each of these. That last push or pull through this paper swatch up here, you can see it hardly took any of that pigment off. And part of that is because so much of that oil has already absorbed into the paper. And that would be different if I was working on a gessoed piece of paper, which I can maybe demonstrate here real quick. So if I take a little bit more of this, put that up here to a little splotch, right? It's pretty transparent. You can really see how wet that is with Gamsol. Now I'm trying to dry my bristle brush with my paper towel to get as much of that Gamsol off as possible. So one thing you want to think about when you're painting, if you're using Gamsol to kind of clean your brush, you want to make sure you're getting as much of that Gamsol out as possible if you're not working like this, right? If you're not trying to spread out your paint with a lot of Gamsol, I would try to dry it off as much as possible before you end up grabbing more paint, because the Gamsol that's still in the hairs of the brush will dilute and mess with the oil kind of consistency of your paint otherwise. So I'm going to grab a little bit of the gel medium here and a little bit more of my burnt umber. I'm going to kind of go in reverse order. So I'm going to take this now, do that over here. There's a little bit of Gamsol I can tell still in here, but it's a little different still than when I had used a lot of Gamsol, right? The edge is a lot more bristly. We're getting a lot more of the organic mark making from the hairs of the brush when there's less Gamsol. And then if I take mostly paint, I have to push relatively hard to really kind of work that into the paper and the surface, right? But now I can really open up a lot of mark making techniques and things. And then if I wanted it to be more opaque, I would just have to use more paint and try not to remove that paint on the surface, right? So that's a way we can start to control our values when we're working in that kind of a method and thinking about transparency versus opacity, right? So now, really quick, while I have this here, if I do this same sort of pull test, you know, we're able to get back to some of the lightness of the ground that was here. So again, it's, you know, that's sort of a difference just when we think about combining colors, right? Things can look slightly different because we're seeing through the pigment and then seeing whatever's underneath it. The color of the brown, it might be a little different between these two sort of piles. And that's because of the combination of this grayish green with the brown versus just the brown over the white clean surface there. Okay, the other thing I wanted to show is with the other brush hairs. So I'm just going to kind of do a similar thing with these, maybe not all three stages. Maybe I'll just start with the pure paint, no medium, no Gamsol. This is a softer brush. right? And what's happening is that this is kind of sticking to the surface. So what I typically like to do is I like to block in my paintings with the more bristly brushes, the firmer brushes, because I can really push the paint around. I can really work it into the surface. I can kind of block out a lot of whatever my ground is, whether that's white or another color. So these types of hairs or brushes are really effective for that when you're sort of working early on. And then later, if you want to have textural marks, these are also really effective for that too. I don't typically block in a painting with a synthetic softer hair brush. Go over here. You know, because these hairs are so much more flexible, they're not very good at pushing the paint into the surface. So it's difficult to kind of mass in an area, right? I'm pushing pretty hard. You can really see how much the hair is getting pressed up against the surface, and it'll feel like you have as much paint on the brush as you did with the hog hair bristle brush, but just because of the flexibility of one versus the other, it's not going to work the paint into the surface as well. And then let's see, I might have to move this actually. Let's see if I can do. This is kind of improvising here a little bit, but with the paper, right, it's really hard to work this into the surface of the paper with a softer brush. So if you're going to work on unprimed paper, you probably want to start with a bristle brush and maybe some Gamsol, right, to really make that spread a lot faster and farther on the surface of the paper. Now, what typically happens with that type of paper is that as you have multiple layers that you're building up on the paper, you're creating these layers of oil paint, right? And if you're painting on paper, that's going to feel different than if you're painting on dried paint or semi-dry paint. So it does get easier to make the paint glide and slide around when you're painting on paint versus when you're painting on unprimed paper, just so you know. Like 2, 3, 4 layers of paint, you'll start to feel that difference that I'm talking about. So now I'm grabbing a little bit of the medium and just keeping the paint and the pigment that was in the brush. I'm not adding more pigment to that quite yet, but you can see just on the palette how with a softer brush I'm able to create a very soft, solid, semi-translucent block of color here. So now if I go, let's go down here, right? See how much easier this is gliding on the surface of the panel versus when I was just using the paint, because the paint was a lot stiffer, almost more sticky, and trying to spread it around. So with a little bit of medium, I'm able to make this glide a lot more. Now again, by adding oil to we're kind of changing the ratio of pigment to oil. There's less pigment and more oil when we add in some of our medium, right? So what happens is this is going to take longer to dry. You know, I would say in general, when we do that, it takes longer for this to dry compared to just the paint because there's more oil. But there can be other factors like how thick the paint is and things like that. If you have any Gamsol mixed in, that can also alter it. But in general, I would say that that's true. Grab a little bit of pigment, add this in with more medium. We'll go over here. So I'm going to try to keep these sort of close together so we don't forget how we came up with these. And probably after I'm done with this recording, I will just kind of wipe these surfaces down. I'll photograph this and then kind of wipe everything down. But again, you know, see how easy it is to fill in an area when there's a little bit more oil in the mixture. And this is pretty transparent again. Let's grab a little bit more medium, a little bit more pigment here. Mix this up. You know, not as easy on the paper, once again, because it's really absorbing the oil pretty quickly, but it's working a lot better than just the paint with this softer brush, right? So You know, the way I'm painting, I'm kind of scrubbing this into the surface. Sometimes you might want to paint kind of like this, you know, where you're kind of laying the paint down. So that's different than what I'm doing in some of the demonstration here. But really, this is about how do we get paint on the surface? How does the surface of our support, right, whether it's plywood or canvas or paper, how does that change the way that the paint wants to kind of get put onto the surface and so forth. So let me grab a little bit of Gamsol again just to kind of round out this example. I'll show you what is happening in the container of Gamsol again. There's not a lot of Gamsol in here, so it is okay for me to tip it slightly, but I dipped the brush. You know, you can see right away how much of that pigment is already leaving the brush, right? So when I'm painting, I don't usually use Gamsol to clean my brushes. I either have multiple brushes or I just wipe as much of the paint out of the brush with a paper towel as possible. And a couple of reasons why I do that. The first reason is because it's a lot safer. I'm not spending as much time working with Gamsol. I'm not having to like potentially breathe in the fumes from the Gamsol. Number two, it makes that brushes last a lot longer. Not only will Gamsol kind of eat away at the oil in our paint, it also is going to over time dry out and basically weaken the hairs of the brush. It also sometimes will start to like break the tips of the hairs off of our brushes if we're really scrubbing the brush in that little well with the holes in it, or at the bottom of our jars. So that's another reason why I don't like to use Gamsol very often. And then the other reason, which is kind of a, you know, it might be a little bit controversial in terms of painting, but I really like when colors that I'm mixing are cross-mixing to other mixtures. I don't know if that makes sense, but if I have, let's say this top row is my palette of a painting. So I've got a blue, a green, a white, and a yellow. If I had a different brush for each of those colors, 4 different colors if you include white, then every time I want to use a green, that green is only going to be mixed with itself on that brush, right? And what happens is every time I put a green mark into my painting, that green is so pure and so clear and so different than the other 3 pigments that it's really going to stand out. And it's a very, very subtle observation that I usually care a lot about. But if I have one brush for all 4 colors, and every time I want to get more yellow or get more white or get more green or whatever, and I don't want the yellow that's on the brush to mix with the green, I'll wipe the brush, right? But there's still a little bit of the yellow on the brush or a little bit of whatever the last mixture was. So in theory, what is happening is there's a harmony that's happening as I'm mixing all of those colors, right? By leaving all of those little bits of residue of pigment at the bottom of the brush, there's just like this subtle harmony that's kind of flowing between all of those mixtures then. So that's another kind of personal reason why I don't like to use Gamsol very often to clean my brushes. I'll use it to thin out the paint when I'm kind of roughing in the start of a painting. So let's see, I'm going to get another little pool of Gamsol here. It's starting to really drip down the palette. I don't typically work with a vertical palette like this, and this is why, because things will drip. But when I'm recording videos, it's the best setup for something like this, that we can see everything all together. Okay, let's grab the Gamsol. So it was 1, 2, and this will be number 3 with this brush. We'll go over here. Right, and I can work over this multiple times to create different textures, different effects. Let's grab a little bit more. We'll go down here. That way these here are all in a row or a column. Right, and one thing that hopefully you can notice right away is that the intensity or the chroma of the color is not quite as intense. I noticed that on this surface more than on this one, but again, part of the reason for that is because the Gamsol is wanting to eat away at the oil that's in the pigment, and then also, you know, kind of by default, it takes out some of the pigment that's in the mixture as well. So we end up with these marks and these colors in our paintings that are a lot less intense and chromatic. Sometimes it's more subtle, but as you continue painting, that might be something that you'll start to notice. But do a little bit of dry brush here, or semi-dry brush. You know, you can really get some really expressive, almost like fluid lines, because the pigment is so thinned out, right, that the marks we can get with our brush are really crisp and clean, almost like you're working with watercolor or something like that. You know, but again, there's a difference between the paper to the super smooth panel to kind of a cotton linen texture of canvas over here. Let me do this test one more time with this brush, just so you have the same data for everything. So if I take my paper towel, I pull through, right, that's takes off quite a bit. I can do the same thing over here. I'm trying to carry a similar sense of pressure for each of these, but it's kind of a challenge. Let's see this one. I'm also trying to get like a new clean area of my paper towel, just so that way, again, since this is a little bit of an experiment, everything is going to be judged with the same conditions, right? That way we can try to compare things as objectively as possible. Then over here. Now I'm not wearing gloves because burnt umber is a relatively safe pigment. At least this one that I have from Winsor Newton is relatively safe with this earth pigment. But again, hopefully we can start to see just the range of contrast that we're able to get, mostly because of the surface that we're painting on, right? So if I tilt my camera up slightly, you can see a little bit more of the top tests up there. But, you know, we tend to have a really bright sense of contrast with a smoother panel and surface. It's more of a challenge to get a cleaner, high contrast, sort of subtractive mark on surfaces that either are very absorbent or have a lot of texture on them. So again, I'm doing this as an example so we can see potentially why a mark or a surface or a texture isn't happening the way that you maybe want it to happen. But in a demonstration like this, we can kind of point to some of these different variables that are factoring into the result of the mark and, you know, the brush stroke and all of that kind of stuff. So before I end the video, I also was just going to show a little bit of a palette knife demonstration because we have different surfaces here. So what I'm going to do, without using like medium and without using Gamsol, I'm just going to talk about marks we can get with a palette knife. So if I take about, let's see, I'll do this sort of thing. If I have this much paint on my palette knife, I'll try to have this much with all three of the surfaces to keep it pretty fair and equal. But if I go down here where it's pretty clean, I can take this, I can start to apply this onto the panel. I can really move it around. I can scrape some of that paint off. I can drag the palette knife around to create more of a organic kind of textural surface. I can kind of scratch into it. I can reblend it if I want to, right? But what I typically find is that this tool gives a very different character of mark in comparison to a brush, right? It's hard to get that really smooth, subtle, soft gradation of values or chroma or texture with a palette knife. You typically have to adjust the color properties to get that kind of an effect because it doesn't have that soft, brushy ability. So, but it can do things that our brushes can't do, right? So this is why having a palette knife, I think, is really exciting and really important. It's because it opens up a lot of different possibilities. Let me grab a similar amount of paint again, just to prove that things are fairly consistent here. Let's do this down in this bottom corner and pull my camera back a little bit. So if I go down here, right away, there's a lot more negative space of the color of my panel because of that texture, right? So those little ridges from the brush that I was using to put on the gesso and to put on the oil ground, they're creating these little ridges where the paint is kind of like bumping the ridge and then jumping over part of the surface where there's kind of like this cavity. It is super microscopic, but that's what's giving us this different texture and this different type of mark, right? So I can scrape this, and it probably sounds really obnoxious because my microphone is like right down here by my palette, but you know, I can scratch into this as well, but again, not as bright of a mark because the surface is textured. Now let's go up to the paper, and then we can start to close out this recording. Here we go. So you can see how much paint is there. And we'll go, let's go up to this top part up here. Hopefully my phone doesn't slide. Let's see how it looks on the paper. So the paper is a lot smoother than the linen panel is, but it takes a lot of paint. Like, look at how dark that swatch is, because for it to be opaque, I have to use a lot of paint. I'm basically smushing a lot of oil paint into the surface of the paper, and it's again, it's still absorbing the oil. I can scrape off some of the paint, but generally it's going to take a lot more paint to cover the surface of the unprimed paper, which again, I typically recommend if you're going to be making, you know, a large painting, I wouldn't use unprimed paper for this reason, right? Because you're going to have to use a lot more of your paint to actually cover and coat the surface of the unprimed paper. But for things like your color charts, you know, where you're having to work opaquely anyways, this is a really good material to use. Again, once this is dry, I can cut this out. You know, I can stick this in a sketchbook. I can keep this by my palette. I can tape it on a wall. So it becomes a really handy tool for my painting process. But I think that is kind of the end of my demonstration for this video. You know, obviously I'm over an hour. It's almost an hour and a half in the recording, but there was a lot of good information that was shared here. I'm hoping that this can be a really good guideline for ways to apply paint, especially at the beginning of your process. So I'm hoping to start a demo painting that I'll be recording as well today or in the next few days, and that'll be kind of a case study where you'll see me, you know, using some of these approaches and methods for mark making and that kind of thing. As I'm kind of wrapping up, maybe what I can also do is just share the process of wiping off these panels. I feel like sometimes we, just by a step that feels very functional or practical, we can learn something else, and there's a chance that maybe there's something interesting that we can talk about as I wipe this off. So I won't end the recording quite yet, but you know, this is a good sort of screenshot that I can always take later if I wanted to keep. Let me see, actually, might as well see if I can get a quick photo here before I wipe these surfaces off. So let's see here. So I apologize, I know this isn't very exciting to see in the video, but this will be helpful to save for future examples and presentations. now I can continue. So I put a glove on because this is probably going to be fairly messy as I'm wiping off the surface here. But let me also just show you in the video what each little pile kind of looks like. You know, the areas that had a lot of oil or Gamsol right now, they look very wet. Areas that were just the paint are a lot more opaque. They look a little bit more satin, kind of dry in terms of their surface quality. And that's something that will change as your painting is drying over time. So, you know, I wouldn't get too used to the sort of like reflective quality of your paintings as you're working on them. What you might start to find is certain pigments dry to a different kind of consistency or a different sort of reflective quality. And that can be evened out later with varnish if you're interested in changing that surface quality. But if I just go through and just kind of like semi, you know, roughly or with quite a bit of pressure, go through and wipe this off, we'll see where we've kind of like stained the surface. You know, then if I gently rub the whole surface, basically what I'm doing is I'm pushing whatever's left in terms of oil and pigment, maybe Gamsol, around the surface of the panel and kind of like toning the surface. But if I wanted to, I could choose to leave this the way that it looks and use some of this noise, some of those marks, some of that texture, just the variety of soft and harder edges or light and darker passages, depending on what I want to do with the painting. But I'd rather have this be a little bit more even throughout, and therefore just keep this as kind of like a toned panel to paint over. And again, this is with burnt umber, so it's a earth tone. It's relatively warm. It's kind of a an orangish brown color. Right, so I'm pushing a little bit harder in some of these areas where there's darker shapes and passages to push the texture of the paper towel into those grooves of the grounds, and the gesso, and the canvas texture. Right, so now because I've basically stained the surface of this panel, you can really start to see more of that, the textures from the brush strokes of the gesso or the oil ground, and the weave of the canvas. All right, so there's one. You know, but the nice thing is we can get to a fairly consistent, cohesive, continuous sort of quality of color, of value, of texture by going through with a paper towel and, you know, taking off that excess material. So now we'll do the same thing here with this panel. Let me show you the surface. So what typically also happens a lot when we're working on really, really smooth panels like this is that the paint is a lot more noticeable. It has more of a physical presence on the surface because it's not competing with the texture of a canvas or another type of texture that maybe you're creating. But because of that, that might be something that you either will really like with your painting. Sometimes you won't like that aspect, but it's something that does come through depending on, again, what we're choosing to paint on with our substrates. So here's my rag. Let's go ahead and try to wipe some of this around. Same thing, I'm going to first go over the whole thing with kind of a lighter pressure, like a moderate sense of pressure. We'll see where things kind of remain or have kind of stained the surface. Let's flip this around. Again, kind of a light pressure, you know, so you can tell right away, like, there are some differences, right, in terms of the space that's created, in terms of a sense of atmosphere, a sense of variety. If these were two finished paintings, I would personally look at this one and go, that has a lot more to offer in terms of variety in terms of subtle contrast. We have some really light shapes in here still, some really active marks, and there's a lot of movement happening, right? And I'm pointing this out because we can get really interesting things in a very efficient, simple, almost intuitive or playful way, right? So I'm just putting a little bit of paint on here and moving it around and creating these really dynamic and interesting images that I can then paint on top of. I can glaze over them. I can draw on top of this. There's a lot that I can still do if I just want to use this as sort of like a layer in the painting, right? And again, that's something I think is important to sort of talk about, is that when we're building a painting, we can think of it in terms of layers, kind of like if you work on Photoshop and you have these different layers to import images, to adjust color properties, to duplicate things. Making a painting is basically the same thing. I mean, that's where Photoshop's design, I think, came from, right? It's when we're designing an image and we're thinking in terms of layers. We can break the process down into multiple steps, right? Which gets back to what I presented on a few days ago, depending on when you watch this video. Earlier in the semester, I shared a presentation on direct versus indirect painting methods. And, if this was layer number 1 for this painting, whatever this could become, then, this would be an indirect painting. Now, if I said, okay, this is finished and I'm going to frame it up and I'm going to photograph it, it's part of my portfolio, it's going to an exhibition, whatever. If I've kind of like decided this is a finished painting now, this would be a direct painting because it was made in one session. It was made in kind of a wet into wet process or alla prima process. So there's no right or wrong, but there is a difference when we think about the way that we construct our paintings. And again, each approach has its own pros and cons and reasons why it makes sense to do that approach. Let's go ahead with our paper. I'll just kind of hold this against the board. I don't have the greatest setup right now in terms of noise. I apologize if there's any like obnoxious noise that's coming through. So again, right off the bat, I'm pushing about as hard as I was with the other two panels, and I'm really not changing the surface very much. Basically, it just feels like I'm darkening all of the areas of white blank paper. And this, again, is proving how absorbent paper is when we paint on paper, and where that could be something that is helpful to our vision of our paintings, or it can get in the way of what we're trying to do. But this is what just sort of came off. If I open this up and find a cleaner area of my paper towel, I can try to get a little bit more of this paint off of here. But it's really not going to do a whole lot now at this point. This paint has really started to soak into the pulp of the paper, and we can really see the difference with the materials now and just their kind of natural qualities in terms of the way things absorb, the way things slide around or glide on the surface, the way that things sort of soak into the material. And there's just some pretty big differences here. One thing I kind of regret that I wish I would have had prepared for this demonstration was also sharing an example of a acrylic gessoed panel or canvas. So that's one thing that would have presented maybe a few differences, but what I typically notice when I'm working on an acrylic primed panel is that everything looks fairly even and kind of like wet when I'm working on it, and then as it starts to dry over a day or a few days, then I start to notice that sort of like sinking in effect with the oil that I talked about earlier. I have a feeling it would have still looked kind of like either of these two examples, just for the sake of this video. But yeah, I think that's the end of the video. Thank you for watching the full thing. I hope this was useful. I hope that if you've had any sort of lingering questions about surfaces, about substrates, about, you know, ways that we can thin out the paint and how they're different. I'm hoping that this could answer some of those questions or curiosities. Again, just as a general rule of thumb, if you want to thin out your paint and you're not concerned about the integrity of that layer in the painting, right? So if you're not afraid to have a very weak kind of layer in terms of the chemical bonding properties, then Gamsol will work just fine for that. So if it's the beginning of the painting stage and you want to sort of thin out the paint where you're kind of like drawing with more line, maybe you're wiping and subtracting material, it's totally fine to use the Gamsol, I think, at that stage of your painting. Or if you're working on paper and you want to really coat that initial layer and get a lot of paint down, you can use a little bit of Gamsol. I would never, in general, I would never use Gamsol to the same degree that artists use water when they're working with acrylic. Using a lot of Gamsol rarely is a good thing in my experience, especially if you're working relatively small or at the scale that we will be working at this semester in this class, which is at most 2 feet by 3 feet. So I wouldn't use Gamsol like water when you use acrylics or other mediums. But now if you're glazing and you're kind of in like the middle of a indirect painting and you're on layer number 2 or 3 or whatever, then I would try thinning out your paint with the medium instead and see what happens. You'll retain a lot more of the luminosity in the pigment. You'll retain a lot more of the chroma. You're keeping more pigment in that mixture than you would if you were using the Gamsol like I was over here on the palette. So again, I'm hoping that that answers some of those maybe questions about Gamsol versus a gel medium like we have in our semester in this class. As you'll see and find, if you continue painting or if you are very interested in oil painting, there are a lot of materials out there that we can purchase, that we can use, that have different working properties. In general, I think, you know, it makes sense to only have 2 different mediums at most, right? One that's more of a heavier body medium, kind of like a gel medium, and then more of a thin sort of bodied medium, a fluid medium, which you can find lots of examples of through most art suppliers. But for this class, I found it really helps to have a gel medium because we're not diluting our pigment down super far with that medium, but it does add it can add a slight glossiness to the paint, and it can also, as I've been mentioning, create a really nice even sort of glaze, which I hope to demonstrate at some point in a future video. But yeah, that's it. I'm going to end it here. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more demonstrations, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.